Hi, everybody, and welcome to our latest edition of the Radical Philosophy Hour. Sorry for any confusion. It turns out it looks like Facebook is down, but what we've decided to do is go ahead and move everything over to YouTube. That way people can access us live. Hopefully some people will be able to join us, but we'll see how this works out. Hopefully it happens. You hate to see, such fine folks as Facebook have such a bad day. Yeah, that's my version of humor. So what we're going to do today is hear from Devin, Zane Shaw, and Joan Braune. They will both be talking to us about issues that are, certainly on a lot of people's minds, especially in the wake of the Trump administration. So questions of fascism and anti-fascism. Devin is the author of numerous books, including The Philosophy of Anti-Fascism, Punching Nazis and Fighting White Supremacy, as well as Egalitarian Moments from Descartes to Rancière, and recently multi-author collaboration on Necrocapitalism, a Plague Journal. He's co-editor of the book series Living Existentialism, published by Rowman and Littlefield. He also teaches philosophy at a community college in so-called British Columbia. I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Devin, and then we'll come back to Joan in a little while.
Okay, so today I'm going to talk about an essay that I've already written, but it's still something that is, the position I take is in some ways still a minority position, at least within academic discussions. And so I'm going to talk through that. It's called 7 Theses on the Three-Way Fight. And so I'm going to walk us through a couple of definitions and then some discussion. I actually have slides. Do you know how to figure that out quickly, Brandon?
Yeah, sure. Sorry, I should have asked you that already. My apologies. So give me just 1 second and I will, let's see, you are now going to be a co-host. And once you're a co-host, you can share.
Okay, let's see here. So you can see it now, right? Because it looks different to me than. Nope, that was not what I wanted. Okay, so you can see that?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so the 7 Theses on the Three-Way Fight. To try to keep it short and just talking points, I've created this so that I can just kind of give the essentials. So I go through 7 theses, and in fact, there's a preface to it that is, I think, is in agreement with what Joan says, in the general idea that it challenges assumptions that we have about extremist studies and things like this here. Since he's jumping on the computers, everybody. Okay, so and then I get into the 7 theses. So the first 2 are going to be definitions, and then after that, it's going to be more analysis there. So the first is. Let me move this over so I can, there. Is that fascism, so it's a definition of fascism in the first thesis, is that fascism is a social movement involving a relatively autonomous and insurgent, potentially mass base, driven by an authoritarian vision of collective rebirth that challenges bourgeois institutional and cultural power while re-entrenching economic and social hierarchies. Now, this is the unconventional or minority position that I mentioned. Because most people's concepts of fascism can still pretty much be traced back. Well, most leftists, let's be straight here, most radical philosophers can be traced back genealogically, basically to Dimitrov, probably through the Popular Front position of the Black Panther Party, if not George Jackson as well. And their variations on Dimitrov's claim here from 1935, that fascism empowers the open terrorist dictatorship of the most reactionary, most chauvinistic, and most imperialist elements of finance capital. So a couple things here that are just worth pointing out regarding this thesis is that the thesis itself about fascism and how I define it is made in relationship to Don Hammerquist and Jay Sakai's book, Confronting Fascism, and Matthew Lyon's position in Insurgent Supremacists. So that's kind of where mine comes from. The key thing here is that this stresses in some way the mass base of fascism being autonomous from its leadership in terms of its organizational capacity or its reach. And that challenge is a major feature that I think really is evident in Dimitrov, but very constant in subsequent treatments of fascism, that treat any mass base as largely just the product of demagogy or mistaken interests on the part of other classes. And I also would identify it with largely this autonomous mass base in a place like North America is going to be petty bourgeois. And there's plenty of evidence to show that it's not working class, and to present it as such is a mistake. But I won't go too much into that in this particular part. Now, the next thesis 2, is that fascist ideology and organizing develops within a broader far-right ecological niche. And so this draws on a definition from Matthew Lyons that defines the far right as inclusive of political forces that A, regard human inequality as natural, inevitable, or desirable, and reject the legitimacy of the established political system. One of the key motivations for Lyons's definition is that he notes that far-right groups in general don't necessarily organize the hierarchies that they consider themselves to be the top at to necessarily follow racial lines, which is one of the common assumptions we have in understanding fascism. And so the broader sphere of the far right can include groups that are male supremacist or other variations. He can use it to include certain far right Christian groups as well. And so it's basically trying to expand the parameters of understanding where fascism moves within its ecological niche. It moves within these various groups. It can recruit from them. It can form alliances. And it's because of this that anti-fascists, when they fight back, put pressure on these alliances and lead them to splinter. The second part is that they reject the legitimacy of the established political system. And that means Lyons here is drawing on their own ideological self-descriptions while criticizing them to say that they commonly view themselves as attacking the legitimacy of the established political system. But when we translate it into critical terms, very commonly what they're rejecting is what I've mentioned in the first thesis, is largely bourgeois political and cultural power and not capitalism. So there's some, restrictions to that. The third is really getting to the core of the three-way fight against insurgent far-right movements and bourgeois democracy, or in liberal terms, or ideological terms, liberalism. So the key concept they have is that there isn't just two sides of a struggle, but rather in anti-fascist work, three sides. And in some ways, this can help us understand the kind of liberal horseshoe theory that's out there, which would say, because both anti-fascists and fascists are quote unquote violent, that they are that the two extremes meet at the tips of the horseshoe. And the first comment I have here is about that. It says, though revolutionary movements and far-right movements are insurgent forms of opposition against bourgeois democracy, my enemy's enemy is not my friend. And so while it may be that, in fact, these are insurgent forms, that particular aspect isn't meaningful enough to say that there should be any kind of alliance between revolutionary groups and far-right groups. In fact, there shouldn't be. And one other aspect about the horseshoe theory there is just to add to that, is to say when liberals present that, what they do is they empty far-right or fascist movements of the actual political content that differentiates it from other forms of insurgent resistance or opposition. So they want to, actually, in my view, where they have a commonality with some far-right approaches to it, is they want to really shift it away from the political aspects and try to highlight merely organizational forms. So there we could say militant anti-fascism is opposed to far-right movements. That's the first bullet point there. And the second says, there are differences between, which I'm just about to highlight, between militant anti-fascism and liberalism, but we can at least acknowledge a commonality, or what I call a line of adjacency in my work, which says there is a shared appeal to egalitarianism within militant anti-fascism or revolutionary movements and liberalism, even though their actual implementation of egalitarianism is different. But it does make a broader sense of everyday anti-fascism possible. Now, what are the differences? For quick and dirty definitions, militant anti-fascism upholds the diversity of tactics to combat far-right and fascist organizing. It organizes as a form of community self-defense, which at least ideally builds reciprocal relationships with marginalized and oppressed communities. In addition, it ought to recognize and uphold the revolutionary horizon of anti-fascist struggle. Fascism cannot be permanently defeated until the conditions which give rise to fascism are overthrown. Whereas liberal anti-fascism, in Mark Bray's concise definition, entails, quote, a faith in the inherent power of the public sphere to filter out fascist ideas and in the institutions of government to forestall the advancement of fascist politics, end quote. Liberal anti-fascists appeal to the democratic norms of these institutions, but they also assume that law enforcement will apply a force to repress fascism when it constitutes a legitimate threat, an assumption which you'd think would be challenged even at this point, but miraculously, from a liberal ideological perspective, has not. One last thing here is to talk about the commonality or adjacency between bourgeois democracy or liberalism and far-right movements or white supremacist movements, or what I will call in a later thesis, white supremacist settlerism, is that we should highlight that all far-right groups are ideologically system oppositional, whether or not their view of what the system is correct or not, but not all of them are actually organized in system oppositional forms. So, sorry. Some of them frame their actions as system loyal vigilantism, which I would define as the use of violent tactics to harass, intimidate, or physically harm individuals or groups participating in transformative egalitarian movements, which is a broader definition than anti-fascist groups or whatever, but it's because they're motivated by opposing a wide variety of transformative movements. I'm going to talk more about the commonalities between bourgeois democracy or liberalism and far-right groups. But one of the things that I want to highlight for thesis 3 is just to say that while some levels of law enforcement tend to be permissive or deferential towards system-loyal right-wing vigilantism, there are recent examples of law enforcement at the federal level moving to repress system oppositional groups organized around armed insurgency. And so we should be able to recognize that there are those different responses meeting certain political exigencies, and that we can't just say, oh, well, we see an armed insurgency, even though it's very tiny, like the Boogaloo movement, and say, oh, well, there must be some commonality between that and left-wing movements or something like this. And so largely it's just to say that there are differential responses of law enforcement to different types of system oppositional forms of far-right groups, whether they organize that way or they're ideologically. The fourth thesis says the particularity of the three-way fight is dependent on concrete social relations. So in North America, far-right movements emerge in relation to broader ideological and material forms of settler colonialism, which includes meaning that capital accumulation is imbricated in elements of white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, ableism, and indigenous dispossession. And so part of my work is trying to draw the paradigm that's commonly recognized in the US, which is how fascist groups arise with anti-Black, forms of anti-Black racism, with the way we see it in Canada quite frequently, and sometimes in the Pacific Northwest, actually, if I keep up with that, since that's kind of regional, anti-Indigenous racism or outright celebration of Indigenous dispossession. And so what I say here is it produces a certain kind of ideology that merges them together, which is what I call white settlerism, which privileges both white entitlement to land as possession or dominion over the colonized sovereignty and autonomy, because as one of the key features of settler colonialism is that it is ongoing. It's not in the historical past, but rather the continued dispossession of indigenous nations, and entitlements encapsulated in what Du Bois called the public and psychological wage of whiteness, which I gloss as the hegemonic reorganization of settler state hegemony, which ensured forms of deference and the institutionalization of racial control, as well as opening institutional access to education and social mobility to poor whites. So that's his model for talking about post-Reconstruction, but we can see that, in my view, that's kind of the paradigm or the archetype of various ways we've seen that play out subsequently. Historically speaking, far-right movements are system loyal when they perceive that the entitlements of white supremacy can be advanced within bourgeois or democratic institutions, and they become insurgent when they perceive that these entitlements cannot. So that's the fifth thesis. And this one's a little different because, as you note, it differs from the definition of far-right groups in thesis 2 by saying that some of them can be system loyal, but rather this is giving a broad historical sweep from Reconstruction to the present to say that they move back and forth over historical time. The provisional hypothesis, which I'm working on, is that liberalism and white settlerism were historically able to coexist in North America because their interests converged. And then it's possible that we're seeing them not converge anymore or diverge, which can explain some of the rise of fascist groups. In North American settler colonial societies, far-right and fascist groups demand the re-entrenchment of the social and economic hierarchies which enabled white social and economic mobility. They perceive that their social standing is in jeopardy, and they demand that settler state hegemony be tilted back toward their advantage. Thesis 6. So these are looking, so that talks about the commonalities between, or the ways that hegemony has been built around liberal political structures or bourgeois political structures with a kind of, deferential connection to white supremacist movements. The last two theses talk about militant anti-fascism in particular. So thesis 6 states, a revolutionary horizon is a necessary component to anti-fascist organizing. That is, there can be there's no meaningful way in which fascism can be permanently defeated without overthrowing the conditions which give rise to it, which is capitalism and white supremacy, and in North America, settler colonialism. So while combating fascism is the immediate task of militant anti-fascism, anti-fascists must maintain a revolutionary horizon that says fighting in the streets or doing the particular diversity of the arrangement of diversity tactics like doxing, getting information out, no platforming. These are important things in the short run, but in the long run, those things won't defeat, they won't give rise to the permanent defeat of fascism because they're self-defense structures. So they must have a revolutionary horizon, even if only in a broad outline, in order to avoid being absorbed within the ideological parameters of liberal anti-fascism. And of course, this has been a big issue throughout in North America, because a lot of these are united front movements between socialists, anarchists, and communists of various stripes who have different ideas about what that revolutionary horizon is. So one of the contradictions of militant anti-fascism is because they can't settle that as part of the united front, or we could rephrase it and say, because no horizon wins out ideologically speaking, is that once the immediate threat of fascist groups or far-right groups dissipates, very commonly these groups, anti-fascist groups, fall apart quite rapidly. Militants must also recognize that anti-fascist work cannot merely be absorbed into revolutionary work, which is a common argument that some people will make. They'll say, oh, well, you're just fighting the symptoms and not the causes. And so you should just sit on your hands when you're combating this, instead of combating the symptoms. So don't go out and use the diversity of tactics in the street. Just wait for the revolution and hold your breath for it, apparently. So you don't want to do that either, because anti-fascism is community self-defense. And in my work, I show that much more extensively, and how it ties into concepts of community self-defense through the Black Civil Rights Movement in the US, for example. And then thesis 7, militant anti-fascism must uphold the diversity of tactics. From a practical perspective, that is what distinguishes it from liberal anti-fascism. By the willingness to use the diversity of tactics up to and including physical confrontation to disrupt far-right organizing. Of course, that comes very late. However, effective militant organizing must not transform the diversity of tactics into merely physical confrontation, which is a problematic approach because that's supposed to be, because the cost of that is so high, it should come very late. And alternatives should be pursued because, of course, the critical question is always which tactic can cause the greatest disruption to far-right movements at each stage of organizing, and planning should be made around that. And so I'll just end on that critical question there. Thank you. Oops.
All right. Thanks, Devin. I really appreciate that. Very interesting set of theses. I think it's going to give us a lot to talk about as we go forward. Joan, let me give you an introduction here, and then we'll happily hear from you. Let me pull it up really quickly. I took it down. This no Facebook situation has set us back a little bit. All right, so Joan Braune is lecturer in philosophy at Gonzaga University. She is author of Erich Fromm's Revolutionary Hope, Prophetic Messianism as a Critical Theory of the Future, and co-editor with Kieran Durkin of Erich Fromm's Critical Theory, Hope, Humanism, and the Future. Her current research explores Frankfurt School critical theories, work on fascism, and applies critical theory insights to countering the rise of fascism and far-right movements today, especially in the United States. She's a frequent speaker on countering hate groups, is active in the Gonzaga Institute for Hate Studies, and serves on the editorial board of the Journal for Hate Studies. Take it away, Joan.
Thanks, Brandon. I think there's going to be a lot of nice overlap between these two papers, and we can get some good discussion going. Definitely some related issues and overlapping claims here. This is kind of a selection from my book, which is just about done, on the resurgent fascist movements in the US. And this section looks at critiquing the language of extremism and radicalization, which has been really dominant in, frankly, everything in terms of talking about the far right and fascism. You'll hear it in the media, you'll hear it, of course, from law enforcement and the state. You'll hear it also from activists and academics and mainline organizations fighting hate, like the Southern Poverty Law Center, all use this language of extremism. So I'm challenging that schema here. Confronting the problem of fascism today requires surmounting the language of extremism and radicalization and the theoretical limitations of this terminology and schema. The extremism or radicalization schema, number one, provides cover to the neoliberal political center by blaming racism on a bizarre societal fringe and ignoring structures and policies that coincide with fascist aims. Two, equates the left and the far right, enabling collaboration by counter-extremists with the state and targeting the left. And three, enables and spreads Islamophobia, since Muslims have been racially and religiously coded as extremists. So number one, it is problematic to theorize fascism as a form of extremism or radicalism because it lets the center off the hook, failing to show how the demands of fascists harmonize with long-established structures and political policies. The actions of fringe fascist groups or even right-wing political parties cannot be solely blamed for the racist policies of the neoliberal political center. In the United States, for example, the child separation policy at the US-Mexico border under Trump's presidency was shocking in its brutality and lack of empathy. But Republicans were not wrong to point out that Obama's administration, too, placed immigrant children of color in cages. In Europe, as well as the United States, harsh policies of immigrant and refugee exclusion and mistreatment by politically centrist European governments, while coinciding with fascist or far-right aims, often arise to shore up economic globalization. Bigotry and violent state repression of immigrants of color both assist in creating an underclass of demoralized, vulnerable foreign workers whose numbers can be constantly adjusted to meet the demands of the capitalist economy. The same is true of the way in which other populations in the US, especially Black and Indigenous US Americans, are often sorted back and forth between the categories of exploited workforce and incarcerated masses. Furthermore, fascism is a social movement seeking power and always already connected to sources of power. Even in countries where the far right does not hold significant political offices, fascism draws power and protection from allies within, policies of, and central narratives of centers of political power. These allies include not only some politicians, but also various powerful political funders, think tanks, media organs, and some members of law enforcement, the intelligence establishment, and the armed forces. The relationship between fascist movements and neoliberal centrist power structures is thus symbiotic. Each feeds the other, yet neither can be dismissed as merely an outgrowth of the other. It is equally incorrect to blame all racist policies on a neo-Nazi fringe, as it is to dismiss the threat that outspoken ideological fascists pose by misrepresenting them as mere symbolic representations of the state's already fascist character. Fascists do pose a legitimate threat on their own, a threat that is political and not merely criminal. Likewise, however, it is also the case that neoliberal centrist governments themselves author and originate racist, xenophobic, and otherwise discriminatory and dehumanizing policies that sustain mainstream structures of oppression that have long existed still undefeated in Western political states. Painting the far right as radical and fringe can obscure the ways in which it already holds power. By defending a theoretical framework that presents fascists as extremists, neoliberal power structures can end up lending credence to fascists' own ideas. For example, the European exit model of de-radicalizing people or bringing people out of hate groups, in harmony with the wider counter-extremism narrative, was built on a theory criticized by Liz Fekete, director of the Institute for Race Relations in the UK, who calls this theory white grievance. According to white grievance theory partly agrees with fascist ideology about the causes of fascist distress, seeing immigration, for example, as driving economic crisis and disenfranchisement of the white working class, which is said to have, quote, legitimate grievances, by which it is meant not merely that they are genuinely suffering in their lives in some way, but that they are at least partly correct about their assessment of the political causes of their suffering. Okay, number two. In addition to letting neoliberal power structures off the hook by blaming a convenient bogeyman, painting fascism as fringe extremism allows for a facile equation between the left and the right. Under this framework, leftist ideologies such as socialism, communism, and anarchism can be painted as somehow equivalent to fascism and organized racism, with both the left and the right labeled as extremism or radicalism. Left and right are then seen as locked in a cycle of polarization, and the center is painted as the location of safety and sanity, with the extremes as the source of violence, conflict, and political division. This way of thinking has a long history with the condemnation of slavery abolitionists, labor leaders, and others as extremists, and it is seen in Cold War rhetoric, which painted Western capitalist states as the alternative to the extremes of fascism and communism. And it paved the way for COINTELPRO, the FBI's mass surveillance, infiltration, and violence against and criminalization of left-wing, heavily people of color-led social movements in the 1960s. The extremism frame continues to provide a basis for military intervention abroad. The trend of using extremism frames against the left also continues in the recent period, with the FBI classifying anti-fascists and a nebulous category of Black identity extremists as terrorists, while right-wingers, including Trump, clamored that Antifa should be labeled a terrorist organization. On May 31st, 2020, Trump's Attorney General William Barr released a statement that, quote, peaceful and legitimate protests have been hijacked by violent radical elements. And outside radicals and agitators, including Antifa, were, quote, exploiting the situation to pursue their own separate violent extremist agenda, end quote. On June 26, the Barr instituted a task force on countering anti-government extremists, under which he included Antifa and the right-wing Boogaloo Circle, which is calling for hastening societal collapse and civil war. Just to confuse things further, the Department of Homeland Security tweeted, plainly and accurately, around the same time the Boogaloo included both right-wing and left-wing activists. It doesn't, it's a right-wing movement. Likewise, the appeals of police departments for special gear or other resources targeted at dealing with white supremacist extremist threats can be easily mobilized against people of color, especially African Americans and leftist activists, who are more frequent targets of police violence than the far right. And the far right frequently finds ways to mobilize the role of policing against people of color and the left, for example, by swatting, the practice of calling in fake threats to endanger the lives of targets or political enemies by mobilizing police SWAT teams against them. How quickly and dramatically police and paramilitary forces can mobilize against activists was made again apparent in many cities across America in the 2020 Black Lives Matter protests. In many cases, far-right or fascist armed militia members patrolled or intimidated protests with the tacit permission of police, who also turned against anti-racist protesters with gear allegedly designed to target extremist or terrorist activity. Protesters were met with rubber bullets, tear gas, and sound grenades, and so forth by the police, and targeted by a multitude of car attacks across the country, as well as beatings and other acts of aggression and violence by far-right activists. The equation between left and right that makes it possible to target the left as quote-unquote extreme is also enabled by horseshoe theory, which Devin mentioned. According to horseshoe theory, the further left or right you go on the political spectrum, the more you approach the opposite extreme. And so that the far right and the far left, so to speak, are seen as almost indistinguishable. Horseshoe theory has a number of problems, but among the most prominent is that it ignores the problem that Alexander Reed Ross calls fascist creep. Fascism is always appropriating from, imitating, and trying to infiltrate the left. That fascism attempts to blur the lines between left and right does not mean, however, that fascism is inherently left-wing. An elementary examination of the history of fascism should make this clear. And leftists are among the first victims of fascist genocide and its strongest opponents. Today, fascists continue to target the left, whether through violent street brawls or the disruption of events and activities, online and in person. However, horseshoe theory has a long history, and equations of fascism and communism can be seen as early as the 1920s. What extremism and radicalism do for descriptions of individuals, political theories of totalitarianism and populism often do for broader social movements and political philosophies. Theories of totalitarianism and populism tend to paint both communism and fascism, among other ideologies, as manifestations of the same fundamental tendencies. Totalitarianism theories stress authoritarian power to the exclusion of other ideological components, while theories of populism focus on the use of any rhetoric that pits the people against the elites, a rhetoric that is deployed both by the right and the left, but for very different reasons. Initiatives against extremism, often government funded with counterterrorism money, walk a tightrope between demonizing the left and standing in solidarity with the left against fascist extremists who victimize minorities. This ultimately makes solidarity with the living targets or victims of fascism difficult to impossible for those who rely on the extremism model. Horseshoe theory also contributes to victim blaming by framing the left and the right as not only similar, but mutually creating. Those on the front lines of left-wing struggle, and thus most likely to be targeted by the far right, are painted as equivalent to the far right, are seen as extremists and even causal of the far right's own violence against them. This victim blaming conveniently fits the far right's own narratives. Members of the far right may even present themselves as extremism experts as a means to target the left. Take the case of Jack Buckby, a former member of the British National Party, which was founded by Nazis. Buckby has reinvented himself as a former extremist and counter-extremism researcher, and has published a book entitled Monster of Their Own Making: How the Far Left, Media, and Politicians Are Creating the Far Right. From Buckby, who claims to be renouncing his white nationalist past, we learn that, quote, I was a member of a nationalist political party with neo-Nazi roots that attracted the votes of 1 million desperate working-class British people who had no other option, unquote. Buckby sees immigration into the UK as creating a crisis that is driving people to the far right. Thus, he continues to blame immigrants for social problems as he did before, but now he has simply widened the umbrella of problems to include the far right itself, which he conveniently identifies only with self-identified Nazis. This use of far-right talking points to allegedly transcend the far right and the left is a frequent problem, which is made possible by counter-extremism discourses. In the US, a similar example of a member of the far right targeting the left with accusations of extremism can be seen in the journalism of far-right provocateur Andy Ngo. Ngo's aggressive and facts-optional reporting on Antifa around the country has contributed to doxing of journalists and activists, and has been who have been targeted by neo-Nazis, with some of those Ngo targeted being placed on a kill list by neo-Nazi accelerationist group Atomwaffen Division. Ngo persistently claims that he's not a far-right activist and simply a journalist exposing Antifa. He has even been used by government agencies to testify to lawmakers as an expert on Antifa's extremism. In addition to providing cover to the center and labeling the left as extreme, the extremism radicalization model of analysis enables Islamophobia. Today, Muslims are frequently lumped in with white supremacists and leftist activists as extremists. By linking the left, the far right, and Muslims as extremist threats, the centrist power structures of Europe and North America are then portrayed as neutral bastions of calm, and which they counterpose to the ethnic or religious identities of the Middle Eastern countries that those governments wish to bomb. A summary offered by theologian William T. Kavanaugh describes this mentality. Their violence is religious. Our violence is peacemaking. Furthermore, painting Muslims as extremists enables Islamophobic policies, such as the Trump administration's Muslim ban, initiated by white nationalist Trump advisor Stephen Miller. As with its impact on left movements through horseshoe theory, the extremism and radicalization model leads to victim blaming against Muslim communities and Islamophobia. For example, it has become par for the course in certain circles to blame fundamentalist Muslim clerics in the UK for the formation of the anti-Muslim English Defense League, a violent hate group. According to cumulative extremism theory, which was popularized by counterterrorism theorist Roger Eatwell, Islamist radicalism is causal of Islamophobia. Cumulative extremism analysis is perpetuated by establishment de-radicalization agencies and leaders, such as those involved in UK's PREVENT program or the US's Countering Violent Extremism initiatives, which were recently renamed by the Department of Homeland Security as the Center for Prevention Programs and Partnerships. So just an aside here, you can imagine, if like I'm Jewish and I'm very concerned about anti-Semitism, and I would be very upset if somebody just identified certain Jewish people, even if they were, in the IDF or something, and I'm against the occupation of Palestine too. But if somebody were to say, look, really anti-Semitism is caused by, the particular actions of these particular Jews, I would be offended, and many people would be offended and would say, well, that's anti-Semitism. But the exact same logic is applied to Muslims, and the de-radicalization and counter-extremism industry completely tolerates that, completely tolerates the narrative that Islamophobia is caused by Muslims, never calls that out as Islamophobia. The reasons for acceptance of Islamophobia by experts on hate and extremism are multiple. One of them is the dependence on government counterterrorism funds for their research. Am I doing okay on time here? Let me check the chat. Okay, perfect. Which suggests they either agree with narratives that frame Muslims in their country as a dangerous radicalized threat, or that they have financial incentive to go along with an Islamophobic discourse. The resources for countering Islamist terrorism far outmatch resources for countering fascist and white supremacist terrorism, although researchers in the latter area may also vie for funding from the same pools and be drawn into shared discourses. Expert on Islamophobia and its ties to the security state, Arvind Kugnandi, writes about counter-radicalization as a career. Young scholars enter the mini-industry of national security think tanks, terrorism studies departments, law enforcement counterterrorism units, and intelligence services to work on modeling radicalization. Of course, scholars of political violence should want societies to make use of their research in order to reduce such violence, Kugnandi writes. But true scholarship also involves a duty to question the underlying assumptions that define the discipline, particularly when those assumptions reflect the priorities of governments that are themselves parties to the conflict under investigation, end quote. Kugnandi points out that discussion of foreign policy is almost never on the table in discussions of Islamist terrorism by counterterrorism experts. Lisa Stampnitsky wrote that the counterterrorism field is taking on anti-knowledge characteristics. The very self-designated experts on terrorism eschewed many forms of knowledge, she wrote, seeing them as a kind of betrayal of commitment to seeing terrorism simply as evil rather than as an object to be understood. A shift in counterterrorism to a focus on radicalization several years after 9/11 was intended by some as a liberal reform measure. Rather than seeing Islamist terrorists as a faceless mob to be bombed out of existence, often pro-imperialist reformers suggested a gentler approach, focusing on understanding psychological causes and attempting to prevent Islamist terrorism through social work type outreach and counter messaging. However, as is frequently the case with reform efforts directed at fundamentally oppressive institutions, as for example, prison abolitionists point out about the history of prisons, the attempt to reform counterterrorism led to new violations of rights and dignity. All right, so I'm just going to stop there. So those are kind of, there are a lot of other important critiques that have been raised around this discourse, but those are kind of three points we could look at. Equating the left and the right, the defense of sort of mainstream social policy, and the attack on Muslims. Thanks.
Awesome, thank you, Joan. That's a really nice. It seems like these two papers come together really nicely. So one of the overlaps that I'd like us to kind of focus on, I'm going to be less able, I think, to take, unfortunately, comments and questions from outside just because of what happened with Facebook. You know, one of the things obviously that there's a lot of overlap around is this question of the horseshoe theory and this concept of a formal identity between the left and the right. So on that, it strikes me that, you know, this erasure of content is very interesting. And Devin, I know you mentioned that. So I wonder if you both wouldn't mind sort of stepping in to talk about that a little bit. I notice even when you think about terrorism as a category, it removes, you know, kind of like any, it's a formal concept which doesn't sort of speak to why or the ends pursued or the intentions and so on. And violence typically, you know, anti-violence or that kind of rhetoric often does the same thing. It sort of focuses on the form rather than the content. So I don't know, Joan, if you'd like to maybe start, and then Devin, if you'd like to come in afterwards.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Form rather than content. And I think both matter. And I think there are kind of characterological questions about, you know, what attracts people to fascist movements. You know, I think the stuff on the authoritarian personality from the Frankfurt School is still like very relevant and useful. And ultimately what I'm trying to do is sort of combine this critique that I have here today with thinking about how we can still do some of that kind of analysis of psychology and character in ways that are not depoliticizing. But yeah, I think it's ideological language. It's vague by design. It's doing what it was designed to do. And I think what I also want to think about too is how do we distinguish just, you know, characterologically, so to speak, like the person who wants to overthrow things. that can't be our image of, you know, the person who poses this particular kind of threat. And there are a lot of these kind of psychological generalizations too, where the fanatic or the person who feels things very strongly or believes in something very strongly wants to overthrow things, this kind of thing. And then that gets fed back into the analysis to, like, you know, back up the extremism narrative even more. So yeah, I don't know, Devin, I'm sorry. Why don't you weigh in and we can discuss?
Yeah, I just think the main thing, at least from my perspective on the horseshoe theory and common things like that, is the goal of the status quo is to empty these other movements of the political content, because it just says, oh, well, they're just violent groups. Well, there's the meaning of the violent groups, quote unquote, is actually found in the political content, and it can help you sort that out. But it's in the interest of, I mean, it's the same way, and you know, Joan, you pointed this out too. It's very common to the totalitarianism discourse in philosophy, which tends to look at, you know, fascism and communism and try to point at social control at the same time that it and here's the way I would then build on this analogy, say at the same time that it doesn't look at modes of social control that would be endemic to Western societies that are producing this kind of discourse, at the same time that you present insurgent groups, whether they're left or right, as violent, you're also nullifying the effects of state violence as at the same time. It's just, oh, well, the police action is not violent, it's just neutral application of force. And so that's another way that discourse is very problematic, because it wants to empty, and I think we were really confronted with a lot of this in 2020 with the anti-police uprising, or whatever you want to call it, is that it really put that right up front with the idea that it's calling police violence right to the front of the discourse, without neutralizing it as if just merely an application of force that has political right or juridical right behind it.
You know, so what you just said though raises some questions for me, Devin. So I would like you to kind of, and I think you even kind of noted some of the friction here. So maybe you could explore this a little bit further. But you talk about the idea of a system loyal violence and system loyal fascist groupings, even though that in a way is a little bit in friction with your sort of initial definition of fascism. And then it struck me that to some extent, Joan, it sounded to me almost that you were kind of really strongly hitting at the system loyal component of what is happening in some of these movements. So one question is about this idea of system loyalty and system loyal kind of violence. And then I think that connects into the question of state and the violence of state and capital. That is, to some extent, these movements are continuous with, and in some ways in opposition to, the violence of state and capital. So to what extent can we pull them apart, or to what extent do those things, you know, kind of come together? I don't know if I'm making sense, but it seems like, especially when you talk about system loyal action on the part of this, you know, on the part of fascist groupings, it seems to me pretty clear that they're operating as an arm or a sort of paramilitary wing of state and capital. So anyway, I'll put that to you all and see what you think.
Well, since it started with that, I'll just start. You know, the idea of system loyal vigilantism was something I came up with while trying to make sense of what was happening with, like, sort of parapolice or far right groups showing up to be against, you know, the anti-police uprising, marches, whatever you want to say, protests. And I was trying to make sense of that because, you know, in the discussions you would find on the Three-Way Fight blog or with the authors that I engage with, is that there's a bit of a struggle to try to say, well, if ideologically they're system oppositional in the sense that they are against, in my view, they're against sort of bourgeois political and social power, largely in parliamentarian institutions in that regard, right? And you see a bit of that on January 6th. But it was trying to say they do conceive of themselves as protecting something. And part of my argument is trying to draw that to the system loyalty is a connection to the kind of mythos of the white settler colonial ideology that is definitely present in both the United States and Canada. That doesn't necessarily, it's like its own, you know, it's like that manifest, the best way to say it is its closest analog is Manifest Destiny in that sense, is they identify with certain aspects of the American political project, but they resent or they are oppositional against what they perceive to be any mechanism that is attacking their social or economic prestige or standing. And remember that perception is important, because that doesn't mean it's necessarily is happening. They can perceive it that way. And I think that's phrased well when Joan mentioned the part about white grievances, because it also shows the connection to everyday sort of political things. You know, I had joked somewhere, and it might even be in that piece, and I've done it a few times, is if you really want to see white identity politics in action, it just kicks into gear every 4 years when they go out and try to find like the mythological everyman that's sitting at a diner and ask him what his views are, right? And it's like, this is just playing hardcore white identity politics as if it's merely about an election. And so, you know, a lot of the ways, the biggest and most complicated part of some of this is a lot of those kind of ideological things that are built into settler colonial racism or oppression are so deeply normalized in some ways in mainstream political discourse that it becomes very hard to disentangle them in that regard.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. I think the I like the term system loyal also. I think that's I was somewhat emphasizing kind of system loyal vigilantism. It's both. I mean, fascism, it's a defense of authority, it's a defense of hierarchy, it's a defense of systems that are already there. But it's also this kind of rebellious reactionary movement, and it thinks it's rebelling against the present order. It's bringing back something that's been lost and remaking it in this radical new way. And both of those things are true. But I think, you know, even at its most sort of rebellious, it's also engaged in power. You know, like I think Steve Bannon, I look a lot at Steve Bannon, and he's like a great example of this because he's like an incredibly powerful person. Was part of the Trump administration for a while. He's a millionaire. He's got an international network of fascists, many of whom are in government, prime ministers and presidents and so on. But I think he really believes in this sort of profound way, you know, that he is. I don't think it's an act that he thinks he's fighting the system. Like he really thinks he's like fighting the man. And you know, I think Matthew Lyons, who you mentioned, is really good on this, that you were using in his Insurgent Supremacist book. It's both. Yeah, it's both rebellion and it's defense of the order. This is why I think the whole kind of the extremism analysis tends to just sort of train us to look for rebellion, right? Like rebellion is the danger, people that are rebellious or people that are confronting the establishment. But there are different kinds of ways of doing that. Like not everyone who wants to have a revolution, even a violent revolution, is an accelerationist in the sense of wanting to destroy the world to save it, which I think fascism fundamentally is. It wants to sort of, it believes in this kind of mythical cycle. You have to destroy things in order for them to be reborn. And the left traditionally doesn't believe that. Like we believe in revolutionary struggle, but it's not about sort of maximal destruction to sort of magically tip history. At least that's not my reading.
Yeah, kind of connected to all these things. You know, one thing that Devin mentioned, and I think it's come out in the aftermath of the January 6th events, is the initial response of most liberal thought is to say that populism is the problem, demagoguery, and therefore we have both, in a sense, this kind of critique of some sort of nascent critique of authoritarianism. So that's Trump as autocrat. You hear that frequently. But then connected to it is this idea that there's a mass working class base. And so, Devin, it struck me that you were saying pretty clearly that's just actually inaccurate. That while there's potentially a mass base for fascism, it mostly is not present in the working class in particular. That in fact it's a petty bourgeois class base. And I mean, definitely in the January 6th events, it appears to be the case that the individuals involved were very much, in that frame and connected to this, I think an interesting thing that I've seen, and it'd be interesting to hear what you all have to say about this, is that one of the things that seems to be emerging, and I think Doug Hinwood talks about this maybe a lot, is the idea of kind of a regional billionaire class in the United States in particular, but perhaps this is true in Canada as well. Devin, you'd have to tell me, where they're not really participating at the level of global capital. And you can think about the Koch brothers here, but there are many others who they don't have that kind of power. They're not a Jeff Bezos, but they are funding and operating in this far right fascist milieu. So I'll stop talking and let you all jump in to talk about the class basis of all this. Devin, you want to go first since
Sure.
Joan was last?
Sure. Yeah. So so you have two questions, right? One is kind of the class structure from above, and then the other one is the class structure from below. So in my view, one of the things that I'm trying to work on and try to, I finished some other stuff and now working on something new, is really trying to get at what I think is just a major problem in leftist discussions, is that there's just a complete category mistake about what the working class is, compared to, I've ended up just going back to the straight up old fashioned Marxist categories, because I think that they're more illuminating than a lot of the things we use. Is just to say, most of what they'll say things like white working class, and most of what they're actually referring to, for reasons that I think are bad, by transforming them into the white working class or white proletariat, they're talking about a labor aristocracy or the petty bourgeoisie. And I think that it's a habit that people need to be disabused of. But I'm not a person that argues, there are some movements that say, there is no working class in, they'll say, because of the wealth of the United States, for instance, there's no working class in the United States. Well, I'm not going there, but I'm also going to say, when you say stuff like, working class, and you're pointing at people that clearly are not part of it, that have some holdings, savings, capital available to them and whatever, and then presenting that as if it's, Trump's base or the base of this, and it's this mythological white working class thing, is highly problematic on the left. And I think it's you can see it happen in other places, but it's because they have motivations that are problematic as well. Like, the general like liberal intellectual thing about, this is a kind of rural or working class movement is a very paternalistic view that largely uses that to discredit. This is an anachronistic view that's way too old now. And so we got to move on. And this magical idea of progress that liberals believe in. At the same time, along with that, the far right likes being called the white working class because that's how they draw some of their strength. They say, yeah, look at us. We're not just a bunch of, as what is it? It's Going Down had an article that called them the rich kids of fascism. We're not just the rich kids of fascism. The second question is harder. And there's a bigger debate, at least in some of the circles that I'm moving in, Brandon, with this, is that it's what is the class characteristic from the capitalist perspective. And one view that I'm tentatively willing to accept is it's a pushback a bit from above of course, national capital that's trying to do something like say, well, what we need to do is dig in deeper to surplus value or resource extraction accumulation within these borders than because we're losing out in the broader global competition. There's everyone disagrees about what the parameters of this is, at least in the people I've been talking about this with. So I can't say that's nearly as definitive or that I'd be nearly as committed to it as I am to this issue about the mythological white working class.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a tricky question for me too. I think, there are people who, I want to distinguish people who voted for Trump because they thought it was in their economic interest from a sort of enthusiastic, fascist movement. Because I certainly know working class people who were like, he promised to bring back the steel jobs and this kind of thing, but they're not out there marching with the Proud Boys, So there is this kind of, I don't know, I think fascism is genuinely like, it's not just AstroTurf, like there's like an insurgent movement there, which is, I wouldn't know, I think it goes across economic classes. I do think it's, traditionally petty bourgeoisie driven, and seems to be still, if you kind of look at who's involved. But it's like both, it's both an insurgency and it's sort of this top-down created thing. Like, I was looking at like the attacks on critical race theory, a lot of that's driven by the Koch brothers, and these libertarian think tanks that kind of manufacture these things. And a lot of the people that show up to these kind of school board meetings seem like kind of fake, like I am a parent who also works for the State Policy Network or whatever, right? But I also think there's like a degree of like genuine insurgency, like reactionary insurgency going on. And so like I'm trying to like figure out like how to talk about both those things, because I think they're both happening. But I think there's an element of reality to it. Just similarly to how the Tea Party was like designed, but also like did attract some like genuine anger and mobilization. So it's tricky.
Yeah.
Wait, I just want to add one thing real quick, just so that no one, this is the common misreading of what I just said also. I'm not denying that there aren't white people in the working class, which is something that some people then say, oh, you said there's no white working class, or you called it mythological, so you don't believe. No. That's not one. So I just got to clarify that, because that's like the number one thing that people say in that regard when they counter that. That's not what I'm saying.
Right. Yeah. I wish we could continue this conversation, because there's a lot more to say and to dive into. Unfortunately, looks like we're running out of time here. A thought I had as we're leaving, it strikes me that you've both, I think, kind of noticed that kind of white grievance side of this thing, and that definitely connects into, I think, both the is there a white working class question, as well as the sort of some of the tropes that you see in sort of liberal discourse around populism or other ideas. I think they're all kind of connected to this question of the nature and meaning of the working class and its whiteness. Of course, that takes us into a much longer conversation, perhaps. I really appreciate you all coming, and hopefully we'll be able to post this on Facebook for folks who didn't get to join us live. Thank you so much. Very provocative talks, and if it's okay with you, I'll be sending you the conversation, the questions, or you can check it out for yourself on Facebook for the Radical Philosophy Association.
Great.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.